close your eyes and let the desert wind carry you back through corridors of time, where the Nile's waters once whispered secrets to those who lived along its banks. Imagine waking not to alarm clocks, but to the golden light breaking over endless dunes, where farmers bent low in fields older than memory, where children played in the shadow of monuments that would outlast empires. Ancient Egypt was not just pyramids and pharaohs frozen in stone. It was bread baking in clay ovens. It was laughter echoing through mud brick homes. It was the rhythm of life flowing as steady as the river itself. Tonight, we walk barefoot through that world, feeling the warm sand beneath us, hearing the voices of people who lived, loved, and dreamed under the same stars you see now. Let the ancient world unfold softly around you, like a story told by candlelight, as we discover what it truly meant to live in the land of the pharaohs. Before we drift deeper into this ancient dream, if these words bring you comfort in the quiet hours, let this be a place you return to. A gentle tap on subscribe means more journeys like this one, more nights where history becomes a lullaby, carrying you softly towards sleep. Now, let's walk together into the dawn of the Nile Valley, where our story begins. Chapter 1. The River's Rhythm, Life Along the Nile. The first sound of morning was not an alarm, but the murmur of the river. Before the sun broke free from the eastern horizon, before the heat began its slow, relentless climb, the Nile whispered its ancient song. Fishermen were already pushing their papyrus boats into the current, their movements practiced and silent, disturbing neither the water nor the sleeping villages behind them. The river moved as it had always moved, dark and deep and patient, carrying within its flow the promise of life itself. Along the banks, the land lay waiting. During the months of inundation, when the Nile swelled with distant rains from mountains the Egyptians had never seen, the waters rose over the fields, transforming the desert's edge into a vast, shimmering lake. The flood brought more than water. It brought soil, rich black silt that had journeyed from the heart of Africa, carrying nutrients that would feed the land for another year. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, named for this precious dark earth that meant the difference between abundance and starvation. Beyond the reach of the flood lay the Desert, the Red Land, where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving, a realm of death and chaos that pressed close against the narrow ribbon of fertility. The farmers knew this rhythm in their very souls. When the waters receded, leaving behind their gift of soil, the planting season began. Men walked behind wooden plows pulled by patient oxen, turning the earth in furrows that ran straight as temple columns. Their bare feet pressed into mud still cool from the river's embrace. Behind them came the sowers, scattering seeds of barley and emmer wheat with practiced sweeps of their arms, movements that were almost ceremonial in their repetition. Children followed, driving flocks of sheep and goats across the planted fields, their small hooves pressing the seeds into the generous earth. This was not easy work. The sun, even in the planting season, showed little mercy. By midday, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the farmers sought whatever shade they could find, the shadow of a date palm, the brief respite of a mud brick shelter at the field's edge. They drank water carried in clay jars, ate bread and onions, rested just long enough to gather strength before returning to the endless rows that needed planting. Yet there was a satisfaction in this labor, a sense of participating in something eternal. These same fields had fed their grandfathers and would feed their grandchildren. The river would rise again. The crops would grow. Women, too, knew the rhythm of the river's seasons. When the men worked the fields, the women carried water from the Nile to their homes, balanced in vessels on their heads, their posture perfect from years of practice. They ground grain into flour using stones that fit their hands like old friends, the repetitive motion accompanied by songs that made the work pass more easily. They baked bread in outdoor ovens shaped like beehives, the dough slapped against the hot inner walls, filling the air with a scent that meant home and safety. The children of the Nile villages grew up with the river as their constant companion. They learned to swim almost before they could walk, splashing in the shallows under their mother's watchful eyes. The river was playground and danger both. Crocodiles lurked in deeper waters, their presence a constant reminder that the Nile was not merely generous provider, but also wild and unpredictable. Yet the children also learned where to find the sweetest lotus flowers, how to catch small fish in woven baskets, how to fashion toys from reeds that grew thick along the banks. As the day aged and the sun began its descent toward the western desert, the villages came alive in a different way. The farmers returned from the fields, their skin bronzed by the sun, their bodies tired but satisfied. Smoke rose from cooking fires as women prepared the evening meal. The air filled with voices greetings called from doorway to doorway, children's laughter, the low of cattle being led to their pens. This was the hour when community became tangible, when the separate rhythms of individual labor merged into the collective life of the village. And always, always, there was the river. Even as families gathered in their homes, sharing food and stories, even as the light faded and the stars emerged one by one, the Nile continued its patient flow northward. It had been flowing long before the first village was built on its banks, long before the first pharaoh united the two lands, and it would flow long after. The Egyptians understood this. They built their lives around the river's rhythm because they knew, with a wisdom born of countless generations, that the Nile was not theirs to command. They belonged to it, not the other way around. And in that belonging, they found their place in the world. The villages that rose along the Nile's banks were built from the earth itself. Mud brick was the material of Egyptian life, shaped from the same silt the river deposited each year. Workers mixed the dark soil with water and straw, their hands kneading the mixture until it reached the perfect consistency, then pressed it into wooden molds and left the bricks to bake under the sun that never failed them. Within days, the soft mud transformed into building blocks strong enough to last generations. From these humble bricks, entire communities took shape. The homes were simple but purposeful. Most families lived in structures of just a few rooms, with flat roofs that became living spaces when the heat of the day finally relented. As evening approached, people climbed narrow stairs to these rooftops, where the air moved more freely and the temperature dropped enough to make sleep possible. Some families slept there under the open sky, wrapped in linen, counting stars until their eyes grew heavy. The roofs served other purposes too, drying fish and fruit, storing grain in large pottery jars, providing a place where women could work their looms in the breeze while watching children play in the streets below. Inside, the homes were cooler, the thick walls providing shelter from the relentless heat. Small windows set high in the walls allowed light and air to enter while keeping out the worst of the sun. Floors were packed earth, swept clean each day, sometimes covered with mats woven from reeds. Furniture was minimal wooden stools, low tables, storage chests, sleeping platforms covered with linen. The wealthy might have chairs with carved legs and painted decorations, but most Egyptians lived with beautiful simplicity, owning only what they truly needed. The doorways of these homes opened onto narrow streets that wound through the villages like veins through a living body. These streets were not planned with geometric precision like the temples and monuments. They grew organically, following paths worn by countless feet over countless years. Children played in these lanes, rolling hoops, throwing sticks, inventing games from imagination and the materials at hand. Dogs wandered freely, accepted members of the community, their barking a familiar part of the village soundscape. Donkeys carried loads too heavy for human shoulders, their patient plotting another thread in the daily rhythm. The river dictated not just agriculture, but the entire social calendar of Egyptian life. During the flood season, when the fields lay submerged and farming was impossible, the pharaoh called upon his people for other labor. This was when the great monuments rose, pyramids, temples, monuments that would echo through eternity. Farmers became builders, joining vast crews that hauled stone from distant quarries, shaped blocks with copper tools, raised structures that defied comprehension. Modern minds often imagine slaves in chains, but the reality was more complex. These were citizens fulfilling obligations, fed and housed by the state, working not just for the pharaoh but for Egypt itself, for the cosmic order of Ma'at that held the universe in balance. Yet even during these months of monument building, the river remained central. It served as highway, carrying stone blocks on barges, transporting workers and supplies. The Nile connected the entire length of Egypt, from the Mediterranean delta in the north to the cataracts in the south. Boats of all sizes moved along its current, massive cargo vessels laden with grain. Elegant pleasure craft carrying nobles, simple fishing boats made from bundled papyrus. The wind blew predominantly from the north, allowing boats to sail upstream against the current with raised sails, then drift back downstream with the flow. The river was communication, commerce, connection. Different regions along the Nile developed their own characters, their own particular relationships with the water. In the delta, where the river split into multiple channels before reaching the sea, the land was lush and green, marshes thick with papyrus and lotus, havens for waterfowl that darkened the sky when they took flight. In Upper Egypt, farther south, the valley grew narrower, the desert pressed closer, and the river became more precious, more dramatic. Yet everywhere, the pattern remained the same: human life clustered along the water, dependent utterly on its annual miracle. The Egyptians did not take this gift for granted. They understood, perhaps better than we can in our modern world of dams and irrigation, that the river was beyond their control. Some years the flood came too weak and famine followed. Other years it rose too high, sweeping away homes and drowning livestock. The perfect flood was a blessing from the gods, particularly Hapi, the deity of the inundation, depicted with a rounded belly symbolizing abundance, crowned with aquatic plants. Prayers and offerings were made to ensure the flood would be generous but not destructive, that the balance would hold for another year. As night deepened and the villages grew quiet, the river continued its eternal journey. Fishermen worked by moonlight, their torches reflecting on the dark water like captured stars. Night birds called from the reeds. The air cooled, finally bringing relief after the day's heat. And the people of the Nile, nestled in their mud brick homes or sleeping on rooftops under the vast Egyptian sky, rested in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same rhythm, the same pattern, the same dependable cycle that had sustained their ancestors and would sustain their children. The river flowed, and with it, life itself. The seasons turned not by temperature, but by water. While other lands marked time by the falling of leaves or the coming of snow, Egypt measured its year by the river's moods. There were 3 seasons, each roughly 4 months long, and every Egyptian knew them intimately. Akhet, the inundation, when the waters rose and covered the land. Pere, the growing season, when the crops pushed green from the black soil. Shemu, the harvest, when the work reached its fever pitch and the granaries filled with the year's survival. During Pere, when the fields were alive with growing things, the farmers became guardians. They walked the boundaries of their plots at dawn and dusk, checking for signs of trouble. Weeds had to be pulled before they stole nutrients from the precious grain. Channels had to be maintained, directing water from the river to fields that hadn't received enough during the flood. This was delicate work, requiring cooperation between neighbors, between entire villages. Water rights were serious business, sometimes leading to disputes that required the wisdom of local officials to resolve. A man who diverted more than his share could doom his neighbor's crop, and with it, his neighbor's family. Children helped with this lighter work, learning through doing, their small hands copying the movements of their parents. A boy of 7 or 8 might spend his days chasing birds away from newly planted fields, his shouts echoing across the valley, his energy seemingly endless. A girl might help her mother in the vegetable garden that every family maintained close to home: onions and garlic, lettuce and radishes, herbs that flavored food and treated illness. These gardens were smaller, more personal than the great grain fields, tended with individual care, and they provided the variety that made meals more than mere survival. As the crops grew taller, ripening under the generous sun, anticipation grew with them. The success of the harvest would determine everything: how well the family would eat, what could be traded or sold, how much would go to the pharaoh's tax collectors. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, taxes were inevitable. Scribes arrived at harvest time, carrying the records from previous years, calculating what was owed. They measured the fields, estimated the yield, and determined the portion that belonged to the state. These taxes supported the pharaoh's court, fed the priests who maintained the temples, provisioned the army that defended Egypt's borders. The system had functioned for so long that most accepted it as natural as the river's flood. Then came Shemu, and with it the race against time. The grain ripened all at once, and it had to be harvested before the sun dried it too much, or birds consumed it, or any of a dozen disasters struck. Everyone who could work joined the harvest. Men wielded sickles with curved blades, cutting the stalks close to the ground, their backs bent for hours that stretched into days. Women and children gathered the cut grain into bundles, tied them with twisted straw, carried them to threshing floors where the separation of grain from chaff would begin. The threshing floors were communal spaces, usually circular, made of packed earth or mud brick, located where the wind could be relied upon. The bundled grain was spread across these floors, and then cattle or donkeys were driven over it, their hooves breaking the grain free from the stalks. Sometimes workers beat the grain with wooden flails, the rhythmic thwacking becoming a kind of music, a percussion that marked the season. The air filled with dust and chaff, and the workers tied cloth across their faces to breathe more easily. It was hot, exhausting work, but there was also joy in it, the satisfaction of seeing the piles of grain grow, knowing that abundance was at hand. Once threshed, the grain needed winnowing. Workers tossed it into the air with wooden shovels, and the wind carried away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back to the floor. This too was skilled work, requiring knowledge of wind patterns and timing. On a still day, winnowing was nearly impossible. But when the afternoon breeze came, as it usually did, the chaff danced away like golden snow, and the clean grain accumulated in mounds that seemed like treasure. The grain was then measured and divided. The scribes were present, ensuring the pharaoh received his portion. They used standardized measures, carefully pouring grain from baskets into larger containers, making marks on papyrus, recording everything. The farmers watched this process with careful eyes, for their survival depended on retaining enough for the coming year's seed for the next planting, food for their families, some surplus to trade for other necessities. A dishonest scribe could ruin a family, taking more than was owed, and while most were fair, the system depended heavily on individual integrity. What remained after taxes was carried to the household storage areas. Most homes had large pottery jars as tall as a man, where grain could be kept dry and relatively safe from mice and insects. Some was set aside immediately for grinding into flour, a task that would occupy the women through the coming months. The rest was sealed and stored, a hedge against uncertainty, a tangible sign that the family would survive until the river rose again. As Shemu drew to a close and the heat intensified toward its annual peak, there was a brief breathing space before the cycle began anew. The fields lay empty, stubble browning under the merciless sun. The farmers rested, repairing tools, maintaining irrigation channels, preparing for the flood they knew was coming. And when the Nile finally began to rise, when the water turned from clear to reddish brown with the silt it carried, when it spread once more across the thirsty land, there was gratitude. Another year, another chance. The rhythm continuing, dependable as breath, as ancient as the stars that wheeled overhead, while the river flowed eternal through the heart of Egypt. Chapter 2. Bread, Beer, and Belonging. The Egyptian table. The smell of bread baking was the scent of civilization itself. It drifted through every village and city, rising with the morning sun, a fragrance so fundamental to Egyptian life that it became almost invisible, noticed only in its absence. Bread was more than food. It was currency offering sustenance of body and soul. The Egyptians had a word that meant both bread and life, and this was no accident. To have bread was to live. To lack it was to face the void. Every household had its bread-making rhythm, usually beginning before dawn when the air was still cool enough to make the work bearable. Women woke in darkness, their movements quiet so as not to disturb sleeping children, and began the process that would feed their families for another day. The grain had already been ground, a task that consumed hours each week, 2 women often working together, kneeling before a slanted stone, pushing a smaller stone back and forth, crushing the grain between them. Their arms grew strong from this work, their shoulders broad, their hands calloused but capable of remarkable gentleness when the grinding was done. The flour was mixed with water, sometimes with a bit of salt if the family could afford it, kneaded until it reached the right consistency. Some doughs were leavened, left to rise slowly, developing the slight sourness that came from wild yeasts in the air. Other breads were made quickly, unleavened flatbreads that could be baked and eaten within the hour. The variety was astonishing. Egyptians made cone-shaped breads and spiral breads, thick loaves and thin wafers, breads enriched with dates or honey for special occasions, bread stamped with religious symbols for temple offerings. The baking itself was an art refined over millennia. Most homes had outdoor ovens, cylindrical structures made from mud brick or pottery, heated by fires built inside them. When the oven walls glowed with heat, the fire was pushed aside or removed, and the bread was placed directly on the hot interior surface or sometimes on heated stones. The baker had to know by instinct when the temperature was right, too hot and the outside burned while the inside remained raw, too cool, and the bread emerged pale and heavy. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, an inheritance more valuable than gold. In wealthier households and in the palace bakeries that supplied the pharaoh's court, bread making reached extraordinary sophistication. Professional bakers created loaves in the shapes of animals, hippopotamuses and crocodiles, fish and birds. They made breads glazed with egg, breads studded with seeds, sweet breads that were closer to cakes, flavored with honey and spices that had traveled vast distances to reach Egyptian kitchens. These creations were not merely food, but statements of wealth and status, meant to impress guests and honor the gods. Yet even the simplest bread, baked by a farmer's wife in a village oven, carried dignity. Breaking bread together was a sacred act, creating bonds between people, acknowledging shared humanity. When a traveler appeared at a doorway, hospitality demanded that bread be offered. When neighbors helped each other with heavy work, bread was part of the payment. When prayers were said, bread was among the offerings laid before the gods, sustenance for divine beings who were imagined to need nourishment just as mortals did. The temples consumed vast quantities of bread. Every day, priests laid fresh loaves before the statues of the gods in rituals performed since time immemorial. These offerings were not wasted after the gods had symbolically consumed the spiritual essence. The physical bread was distributed among the priests and temple workers, a practical system that fed hundreds while maintaining religious propriety. The great temples had their own bakeries, massive operations that produced thousands of loaves daily, employing dozens of workers who did nothing but bake from sunrise to sunset. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it became the standard unit for measuring value and payment. Workers were paid in bread rations, calculated carefully based on the nature and difficulty of their labor. A common laborer might receive 10 loaves per day, a skilled craftsman 15 or 20, a high official far more. These weren't merely symbolic payments. The bread represented real calories, real sustenance, the difference between strength and weakness, between working another day and collapsing from hunger. But bread alone was not enough. The Egyptian diet, for all its reliance on grain, required variety to sustain health and energy. And so, beside the bread, always, there was beer. The two were inseparable, yoked together in the Egyptian mind as fundamentally as the Nile and the desert, as life and death, as day and night. Where bread was solid sustenance, beer was liquid nourishment, refreshment, comfort, and mild intoxication all at once. Together, they formed the foundation upon which all other food was built, the bedrock of Egyptian existence. Beer in ancient Egypt was not the clear, carbonated beverage we know today. It was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern alcohol, rich with vitamins and calories that made it genuinely sustaining. The color ranged from pale gold to deep amber, and it was often cloudy, filled with grain particles that gave it body and substance. People drank it through straws made from reeds, filtering out the larger bits while drawing in the nourishing liquid. These drinking straws, simple as they were, became personal possessions, sometimes decorated, always kept clean, used day after day. The brewing of beer was women's work, just as bread making was, and the two processes were intimately connected. Beer began with bread partially baked loaves that were broken apart and mixed with water, sometimes with dates added for sweetness and extra fermentation. The mixture was left to ferment in large pottery jars, wild yeasts from the air transforming the sugars into alcohol. Within a few days, the result was ready to drink, a mildly alcoholic beverage that quenched thirst, provided nutrition, and made the hardships of daily life slightly more bearable. Every household brewed its own beer, the process so common that girls learned it as naturally as they learned to walk. A woman's skill at brewing was a point of pride, something mentioned when marriages were being arranged. Good beer could be traded for other goods, creating an informal economy where women's labor translated directly into household wealth. The beer had to be consumed relatively quickly. It didn't keep well in Egypt's heat, so brewing was a constant, ongoing task, another rhythm in the endless cycle of domestic labor. But beer was more than practicality. It was pleasure, community, celebration. After a long day working in the fields under the relentless sun, a farmer would sit in the shade of his home and drink beer, feeling the day's tension ease from his shoulders. Friends gathered in the evening, sharing beer and conversation, their laughter carrying through the village streets. Festivals brought beer in abundance, distributed freely, loosening tongues and lightening hearts. The Egyptians understood that life needed these moments of joy, that survival alone was not enough. The goddess Hathor was associated with beer among her many other domains. She was the deity of love and music, of beauty and intoxication, of all things that made existence sweet rather than merely endurable. Stories told of how she had once been sent to destroy humanity, but was pacified by beer mixed with pomegranate juice, which resembled blood. She drank until her rage transformed into contentment, and humanity was saved. This myth revealed something true about Egyptian understanding, that beer could transform mood, could turn anger into peace, could make the unbearable bearable. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian table held a variety that would surprise many who imagine ancient diets as monotonous. The Nile provided fish in tremendous abundance, from small ones caught in baskets by children to massive specimens that required nets and multiple men to haul ashore. Fish were eaten fresh, grilled over open fires, or preserved by drying in the sun or salting. Different types of fish had different values. Some were expensive delicacies served at wealthy tables. Others were common fare eaten by everyone. Certain fish were forbidden in particular regions, considered sacred to local gods, adding complexity to what could and couldn't be consumed. The river also provided waterfowl, ducks, and geese that nested in the marshes, hunted by men who threw sticks or used nets, or sometimes caught in elaborate traps. These birds were roasted whole, their fat dripping into the fire, their flesh tender and rich. Wealthy households kept domesticated geese, which were force-fed to fatten them, creating a delicacy that wouldn't seem out of place on a modern gourmet menu. The eggs from these birds were prized, eaten boiled, or incorporated into other dishes. Vegetables grew abundantly in Egypt's rich soil and generous sun. Onions and garlic were universal, eaten by everyone from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself. They were more than flavoring. They were substantial food, often eaten raw, their sharp taste cutting through the blandness of plain bread. Leeks and lettuce, cucumbers and radishes, lentils and chickpeas, all these grew in Egyptian gardens and fields. Lettuce was particularly valued, considered sacred to the god Min, associated with fertility and virility. It was served at important meals, carefully washed and dressed with oil. The wealthy enjoyed meat more regularly: beef from cattle, mutton from sheep, goat when other meat was scarce. But for most Egyptians, meat was occasional, reserved for festivals and special occasions. When an animal was slaughtered, nothing was wasted. The meat was distributed among family and neighbors, creating obligations and strengthening social bonds. The organs were consumed, the bones cracked for marrow, the hide used for leather. This wasn't merely frugality, but respect, an acknowledgement that life had been taken to sustain life. Fruit brought sweetness to the Egyptian diet, a welcome contrast to the savory staples that dominated most meals. Dates were perhaps the most important, growing in vast groves where date palms swayed in the breeze, their fronds providing shade and their fruit providing concentrated energy. Fresh dates were eaten by the handful, their honey-sweet flesh satisfying both hunger and the craving for something pleasant. Dried dates kept almost indefinitely, becoming portable food for travelers, workers in distant quarries, soldiers on campaign. They could be ground into paste, mixed into breads and cakes, or fermented into a sweet wine that was served at celebrations. Figs grew readily in Egyptian soil, their trees producing multiple crops throughout the year. The fruit was eaten fresh or dried, and fig trees themselves provided welcome shade in gardens and courtyards. Pomegranates, with their jewel-like seeds, were prized both for eating and for their symbolic associations with fertility and abundance. Grapes grew in the delta and in certain favored regions, eaten fresh during their season, but more importantly pressed for wine, the beverage of the elite, distinguished from common beer by its expense and the sophistication required to produce it properly. Wine production was an art overseen by specialists. Grapes were harvested and placed in large vats where workers trampled them with their feet, sometimes holding ropes suspended from above to maintain balance as the juice flowed. The liquid was collected, transferred to sealed jars, and left to ferment in cellars or buried in sand to maintain stable temperatures. The finished wine was labeled with remarkable precision, the year, the vineyard, sometimes even the name of the vintner, creating records that archaeologists would discover thousands of years later. The finest wines came from the Delta, though vineyards existed throughout Egypt wherever conditions permitted. At wealthy tables, wine flowed freely, served in beautiful vessels of pottery or glass, sometimes metal for the truly rich. Servants poured and repowered, ensuring that cups never emptied, that conversation and laughter never stopped. These feasts were elaborate affairs with multiple courses, with entertainment provided by musicians and dancers, with guests adorned in their finest linen, anointed with perfumed oils, wearing cones of scented fat on their heads that melted slowly through the evening, releasing fragrance. Such gatherings were theater as much as dining, performances of status and wealth, opportunities to forge alliances and display power. Yet even in these elaborate feasts, certain elements remained constant with the humblest meals. Bread was still present, still central. Beer might be supplemented by wine, but not entirely replaced. The act of eating together, of sharing food, of breaking bread with companions, this remained sacred regardless of whether the bread was simple barley flatbread or an elaborate, honey-sweetened creation shaped like a lotus flower. The preparation and serving of food followed patterns refined over generations. Women did most of the cooking, though professional male cooks existed in wealthy households and temple kitchens. The cooking methods were straightforward: boiling, roasting, grilling. Ovens baked bread and could roast meat. Open fires cooked stews in pottery vessels. Food was seasoned with salt harvested from desert deposits, with the cumin and coriander that grew locally, occasionally with more exotic spices that arrived via trade routes from distant lands. Tables, as furniture, were not universal. Many Egyptians ate sitting on the ground or on low stools, with food placed on mats before them. Plates, as we know them, were uncommon. Bread often served as edible plate, with other foods piled upon it, the bread soaking up juices and sauces before being eaten itself. Hands were the primary utensils, though knives cut meat and spoons served liquids. Cleanliness was important. Diners washed hands before and after meals. Water poured from ewers by servants in wealthy homes, from simple jars in more modest settings. Meals marked the rhythm of the day. A light breakfast of bread and beer fortified workers before they headed to the fields or workshops. A midday meal, often eaten where people worked, provided energy to continue through the afternoon. But the evening meal was when families gathered, when the day's labor ended and rest began. This was when stories were told, when children learned the history of their family and their people, when the bonds of kinship were reinforced through the simple act of eating together. Food connected the living with the dead and with the gods. Tombs were stocked with provisions for the afterlife, bread and beer, meat and fowl, fruits and vegetables, all either real or represented in paintings and models, ensuring the deceased would not hunger in eternity. Temple offerings fed the gods, maintaining the cosmic order, keeping the universe in balance. Every meal, then, whether grand feast or simple supper, was part of a larger pattern, a thread in the vast tapestry of Egyptian existence. As night settled over the Nile Valley and cooking fires burned low, as families finished their evening meals and children grew drowsy, there was contentment in knowing that today there had been enough. Enough bread, enough beer, enough to sustain life for another day. Tomorrow would bring its own labors, its own challenges. But tonight, bellies were full and hearts were at peace. The table had provided, as it had always provided, as the Egyptians trusted it always would. And in that trust, in that daily miracle of sustenance, life continued, generation after generation, along the eternal river. Chapter 3. From sunrise to sunset, the working world, before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Egypt was already working. The coolest hours were too precious to waste, and so the day began in near darkness, with people rising from their sleeping mats, splashing water on their faces, eating quick breakfasts before heading to wherever their labor called them. Work was not something separate from identity in ancient Egypt. You were what you did. A man introduced himself by his craft, his profession, his role in the vast machinery that kept civilization functioning. To be without work was to be without place, without purpose, almost without existence. The farmer's day began earliest of all. He woke to a world still cool and gray, the air holding the last whisper of night's relief before the sun began its punishing climb. He checked his tools, the hoe with its wooden handle worn smooth by his father's hands and his own, the sickle whose blade needed sharpening, the rope that would help him measure and mark his fields. Then he walked to his plot, his bare feet knowing every stone and depression in the path, arriving as the first light touched the eastern desert and spilled across the valley. His work was dictated by the season, but it was never easy, never simple. During planting, he guided the plow while his son or a borrowed ox pulled it, turning earth that resisted, that clung to itself, that required patience and strength to prepare properly. He scattered seed with movements his ancestors had perfected, knowing instinctively how much to cast, how to ensure even distribution. During the growing season, he maintained the irrigation channels that brought water from the Nile to his crops, a task that was both physical labor and engineering, requiring understanding of water flow, of elevation, of the delicate balance between too much moisture and too little. At harvest, his work became a race against time and nature. The grain ripened quickly, and delay meant loss to birds, to shattering, to any of the disasters that could strike. He worked from dawn until his hands could no longer grip the sickle, cutting stalks that stood taller than his children, bundling them, carrying them to the threshing floor where others waited to continue the process. His back ached constantly during these weeks, his palms blistered despite their calluses, his body demanding rest that he could not afford to give it. Yet there was dignity in this work, a knowledge that without his labor, Egypt itself could not exist. The bread that fed scribes and priests, soldiers and nobles, began with his hands in the soil. The beer that flowed at festivals and funerals alike came from grain he had planted, tended, harvested. He was the foundation, and though he owned little, and his name would never be carved in temple walls, he knew his worth. The scribe's day began differently, but no less purposefully. He woke in a home more substantial than the farmer's, in a room with plastered walls perhaps decorated with simple paintings. He dressed in clean linen, not the finest quality reserved for the nobility, but good cloth that marked his status as a man who worked with his mind rather than his back. He ate bread and drank beer, then gathered his tools, a wooden palette with wells for black and red ink, a leather bag containing reed brushes, rolls of papyrus, a small pot of water. His workplace might be a temple, a government office, a noble's estate, or even a spot in the shade of a wall where he set up his portable desk and waited for those who needed his services. Literacy was rare, precious, almost magical in a society where most people could not read or write. The scribe was keeper of knowledge, recorder of transactions, bridge between the world of spoken words and the permanence of written records. He sat cross-legged, his kilt stretched tight to create a surface for the papyrus. His reed brush moved with practiced precision, forming hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphs used for everyday documents. He recorded grain deliveries and tax assessments, copied religious texts and medical treatises, wrote letters for illiterate clients who needed to communicate across distances. Each document required concentration, accuracy, care. A mistake in a tax record could cause serious problems. An error in a religious text was almost blasphemy. The work was mentally demanding but physically comfortable compared to farming. Scribes didn't labor under the brutal sun or break their backs with heavy lifting. This difference was not lost on them, and many scribal texts that have survived contain passages praising the scribe's profession while describing other occupations in distinctly unflattering terms. Be a scribe, these texts urged students. Your limbs will be sleek, your hands will grow soft. You will not be like the farmer who toils always, whose clothes are stiff with mud. Yet scribal training was rigorous, beginning in childhood and lasting years. Boys for scribes were almost exclusively male, entered scribal schools where they copied texts repeatedly, learning the complex writing system through endless repetition. Teachers were strict, beatings common for laziness or errors. Students memorized not just how to write, but vast amounts of information, mathematical tables, legal precedents, religious formulas, proper forms for different types of documents. Those who completed this training entered a profession that offered genuine opportunity for advancement, for accumulating wealth, for rising above the circumstances of their birth. The craftsman's world existed somewhere between the farmer's endless physical labor and the scribe's mental discipline. His was a realm of skill passed down through bloodlines, of knowledge held in the hands as much as in the mind, of creating objects that ranged from simple necessity to breathtaking beauty. The craftsman rose with the sun and went immediately to his workshop. a space that might be attached to his home or located in a larger complex where many workers labored side by side, their different skills complementing each other in the creation of finished goods. The carpenter worked with wood that was precious in a land where large trees grew sparsely. Most timber had to be imported from Lebanon cedar and pine that arrived on ships, costly and therefore used carefully, wastefully never. Local woods existed: acacia, sycamore fig, tamarisk, but these were harder to work, less suitable for fine furniture. The carpenter knew each wood's character, how it split and curved, how it responded to his tools. He made beds and chairs, boxes and coffins, boats and chariot wheels. His tools were simple but effective: saws and adzes, chisels and mallets, all requiring strength and precision to use properly. He began each piece by selecting the wood, examining it for flaws, planning how to cut it to minimize waste. The sawing was hard work, typically done with the wood vertical, lashed to a post, the carpenter pulling the saw downward in long strokes. Shaping required the adze, a tool with a blade set perpendicular to the handle, swung carefully to shave away excess wood, to smooth surfaces, to create curves. The finest work involved joining pieces without nails, using pegs and glue made from animal hide, creating joints that fit so perfectly they seemed to be a single piece of wood. For wealthy clients, the carpenter collaborated with other craftsmen. After he created the basic form of a chair or chest, it might go to a specialist who covered it with thin sheets of gold or precious wood veneers, to another who inlaid it with ivory or ebony brought from far beyond Egypt's borders. The result was furniture that was not merely functional but magnificent, meant to display wealth and taste, to last for generations, and perhaps accompany its owner into the afterlife. The metalworker's craft was even more specialized, working with materials that required fire and transformation. Copper was the primary metal, mined in the desert or imported from Sinai, smelted and cast and hammered into tools and weapons, vessels and ornaments. The metalworker's workshop was hot and noisy, the furnace glowing, bellows pumping to raise the temperature high enough to melt metal. Workers poured molten copper into molds carved from stone, creating axe heads and spear points, fish hooks and needles, objects both mundane and essential. Gold, when available, required different techniques. It didn't need high temperatures to work, being soft and malleable. Goldsmiths hammered it into thin sheets, beat it into wires, created jewelry of stunning intricacy: necklaces and bracelets, earrings and rings, amulets meant to protect the wearer in life and death. The gold came from the desert, from mines where conditions were brutal, where workers labored in darkness and heat that made the surface seem cool by comparison. But in the goldsmith's workshop, under skilled hands, that gold became beauty, became wealth made visible, became the radiance of the sun god himself captured in metal form. The potter sat at his wheel, foot pushing steadily to maintain rotation, while his hands shaped clay that had come from the Nile's banks. This was ancient work, older perhaps than any other craft, and yet it required constant attention, constant skill. The clay had to be the right consistency: too wet and it collapsed, too dry and it cracked. The wheel had to spin at the proper speed, faster for small vessels, slower for large ones. The potter's hands moved with certainty born of making thousands of vessels, pulling up walls, shaping rims, creating handles and spouts. When the pot was formed, it was left to dry slowly, protected from direct sun that would cause uneven drying and cracking. Once leather hard, it might be decorated, incised with patterns, painted with slips of different colored clays. Then came firing in kilns that reached high temperatures, transforming soft clay into hard ceramic that could hold water, store grain, contain oils and perfumes. The potter made everything from massive storage jars that stood as tall as a man to tiny vessels for cosmetics, from simple bowls for daily use to decorated pieces for temples and tombs. The weaver's work began with fibers, primarily flax, grown in Egyptian fields, harvested and processed through multiple steps before it became thread. The flax was pulled up by the roots, then redded in water to separate the fibers, dried, beaten to soften it, combed to remove impurities. Women typically did this preparatory work, their hands moving through steps they'd learned as girls, creating thread that was then spun on simple spindles, the twist giving it strength. The actual weaving happened on looms, some horizontal, some vertical. The warp threads stretched tight while the weft threads were passed through them, over and under in patterns that created plain linen or more complex designs. Weaving was rhythmic work, almost meditative, the shuttle passing back and forth, the beater pressing each new thread tight against the last. The best weavers created linen so fine it was nearly transparent, fabric light as air, perfect for Egypt's heat, prized by the wealthy who wore multiple layers of these sheer linens, creating garments that were both modest and revealing, that moved beautifully and marked status clearly. The mason's work was perhaps the most visible of all, for his hands shaped the very landscape of Egypt. Stone was eternal in a way that mud brick could never be, and so stone was reserved for the works that needed to last forever: temples and tombs, monuments and statues. The mason woke knowing his labor contributed not just to the present, but to eternity itself. He was building for the gods, for the pharaohs, for the cosmic order that held the universe in balance. Quarrying the stone was brutal work, done by teams who traveled to distant sites where the right kind of rock could be found. Limestone came from quarries near the Nile, relatively soft and easy to work. Granite, harder and more prestigious, came from Aswan in the far south, where workers cut massive blocks from the living rock using copper tools and wooden wedges soaked in water that swelled and split the stone. Sandstone came from other quarries, each type of stone chosen for specific purposes, each requiring different techniques to extract and shape. Once quarried, the blocks had to be transported, often over vast distances. Smaller stones could be loaded onto donkeys, but the massive blocks used in pyramids and temples required more elaborate solutions. They were dragged on sledges, pulled by teams of men whose muscles strained against ropes, whose feet slipped in sand that was deliberately wetted to reduce friction. When possible, stones were loaded onto barges and floated down the Nile, the river once again proving itself the lifeline of Egypt, carrying not just crops and people, but the very substance of immortality. At the building site, the mason's true artistry emerged. He worked with tools that seemed primitive to modern eyes, but were remarkably effective and skilled. Hands copper chisels and wooden mallets, measuring cords and plumb bobs, levels made from wood and water. He cut stones to fit together with joints so tight that even today a knife blade cannot slide between them. He carved hieroglyphs and relief sculptures, transforming blank surfaces into narratives that would tell stories for millennia. The work was precise beyond what seems possible without modern instruments. The pyramids are aligned to cardinal directions with accuracy that modern surveyors find astonishing. Temple walls are vertical to tolerances measured in fractions of degrees. This precision came from knowledge accumulated over generations, from mathematical understanding, from rituals of measurement that were almost religious in their importance. The mason was not just a builder but a practitioner of sacred geometry, someone who brought divine proportions into the physical world. Working alongside the mason was often the sculptor, whose role was to give life to stone. He received blocks already cut to approximate size, and from them created images of gods and pharaohs, of nobles and sacred animals. This work required not just physical strength, but artistic vision, the ability to see within the stone the form waiting to be revealed. The sculptor worked from drawings and proportional grids, but the final details came from his own skill and judgment. He used chisels of varying sizes, starting with heavy tools to remove large amounts of stone, finishing with delicate instruments that refined details, the curve of a lip, the fold of cloth, the individual feathers on a bird. Some sculptors specialized in particular subjects. One might be known for his skill at carving eyes that seemed almost alive, another for hands that appeared capable of movement. The greatest sculptors achieved a kind of immortality themselves, their work surviving long after their names were forgotten, still speaking across the centuries. The painter came last, adding color to the carved surfaces, bringing final vitality to the sculptures and reliefs. Egyptian painting followed strict conventions developed over centuries. Men painted red-brown, women yellow ochre, the colors derived from minerals ground into powder and mixed with binders. Gods appeared in their traditional colors, recognizable instantly by hue as much as by form. The painter worked carefully, filling in areas blocked out by the sculptors, knowing that his work would be sealed in tombs, would accompany the dead into eternity, would serve as sustenance and pleasure for spirits in the afterlife. But not all painters worked on eternal monuments. Some decorated the walls of wealthy homes with scenes of daily life gardens and hunting, banquets and entertainment. These paintings were less formal, more playful, showing a side of Egyptian art that is sometimes forgotten among the solemnity of tombs and temples. They revealed that Egyptians valued beauty in their living spaces, that they wanted to be surrounded by pleasant images, that art served life as well as death. All these craftsmen, carpenters and metalworkers, potters and weavers, masons and sculptors and painters shared certain things. They worked long hours, from shortly after dawn until the sun's heat became unbearable, then resumed in the late afternoon when conditions improved. They took pride in their skills, knowing that incompetence meant not just poor results, but loss of reputation, of clients, of income. Many worked in workshops owned by temples or the palace, receiving regular rations of food and other supplies, secure but not independent. Others worked for themselves, taking commissions, building reputations, hoping to receive the kind of prestigious assignments that could change their families' fortunes. The relationship between master and apprentice was fundamental to all crafts. Skills were not written down in manuals, but learned through years of observation and practice. A boy entered a workshop as a child, perhaps following his father into the family trade, or apprenticed to a master who would teach him in exchange for his labor. He began with the simplest tasks, fetching tools, cleaning the workspace, preparing materials. Gradually, he was allowed to attempt easier work, always under supervision, his mistakes corrected immediately. Only after years would he be trusted with complex projects, and even then, the master's eye watched, ensuring standards were maintained. This system meant that craftsmanship improved slowly, incrementally, each generation building on the last. Innovations happened, but gradually, tested thoroughly before being accepted. The result was a tradition of remarkable consistency. Egyptian art and craft maintained recognizable styles for thousands of years, far longer than any civilization since. This wasn't stagnation but confidence, a society that had found solutions that worked and saw no reason to abandon them for novelty's sake. As the sun descended and the workday ended, craftsmen cleaned their tools, swept their workshops, prepared for the next day. They returned to homes where their children waited, where their wives had prepared the evening meal. And though their hands were rough and their bodies tired, there was satisfaction in having created something, in having added to the world rather than merely consuming from it. Tomorrow would bring more work, the same work that connected them to their ancestors and would be continued by their descendants. In this continuity, in this endless renewal of ancient patterns, they found meaning that transcended the individual, that made each day's labor part of something vast and eternal. Chapter 4: Love, Family, and the Home. Hearts in the Ancient World. Love in ancient Egypt was not so different from love today. Hearts ached with the same longing, burned with the same desire, broke with the same pain. The evidence survives in unexpected places, scratched onto pottery shards, carved into limestone flakes, words that were never meant to last forever, but somehow did. These love poems reveal souls that felt deeply, that yearned and hoped and feared rejection, just as people do now, across the vast distance of millennia. My heart thought of my love of you, one poem begins, when only half my hair was braided. I came running to find you, and I neglected my hairdo. But now if you let me braid my hair, I shall be ready in a moment. The voice is unmistakably human, caught between desire and the practical concern of appearance, wanting to rush to the beloved, but also wanting to look beautiful. Another fragment speaks more boldly. Your love has penetrated all within me, like honey plunged into water, like an odor which penetrates spices. The imagery is sensual, physical, honest about desire in ways that surprise those who imagine ancient peoples as somehow less passionate than ourselves. Young people met in villages and cities, at festivals and markets, during the communal work that brought everyone together at planting and harvest times. A girl carrying water from the Nile might catch the eye of a boy returning from the fields. Glances became conversations, conversations became walks along the riverbank in the cooling evening air, and walks became something more. Families watched these developing relationships with interest, for marriage was too important to be left entirely to the whims of young hearts, but neither was it typically forced against violent opposition. Marriage in Egypt was more social contract than religious ceremony. There was no wedding ritual conducted by priests, no sacred vows spoken before the gods. Instead, a couple simply began living together, establishing a household, and this act itself constituted marriage. Often, there were contracts that specified what each party brought to the union, what would happen if the marriage dissolved. Women retained ownership of property they brought into marriage, a protection that gave them real power in a world where divorce was possible and not uncommon. The ideal age for marriage was young girls in their early teens, boys slightly older, though this varied by social class and individual circumstances. A scribe might marry later, having spent years in training. A farmer's daughter might marry as soon as she was physically mature, her labor needed in a new household. But whenever it happened, marriage marked a transition into full adulthood, into the responsibilities and roles that defined Egyptian society. The wedding celebration, though not religious, was certainly festive. Families gathered, food was abundant, beer and wine flowed freely. The bride might wear her finest linen, adorned with jewelry if her family could provide it, her hair dressed elaborately, her eyes lined with kohl. The groom appeared in clean linen, perhaps with a new kilt made specially for the occasion. There was music and dancing, the kind of joyful noise that announced to the entire community that a new household was forming, that life was continuing its eternal pattern. The early days of marriage were a time of adjustment, of learning to share space and decisions, of negotiating the thousand small compromises that any partnership requires. The young wife took charge of the household, a domain that was entirely hers to manage. She organized the grinding of grain and baking of bread, the brewing of beer, the preparation of meals. She oversaw any servants if the family was wealthy enough to have them, or did all the work herself if not. The home was her kingdom, and a capable wife was valued beyond measure. The young husband continued his work, whatever it might be, but now he labored not just for himself, but for his family, present and future. His wages or harvest, his craft work or scribal fees all went into the household economy. A good husband provided steadily, protected his family's interests, treated his wife with respect. The ancient wisdom texts advised, "If you are a man of standing, you should found your household and love your wife at home as is fitting. Fill her belly, clothe her back, make her heart glad as long as you live." But marriage was not guaranteed happiness. The love poems speak of joy, but other texts acknowledge the complications. Some marriages were harmonious partnerships that lasted until death parted the couple. Others were marked by conflict, infidelity, disappointment. Egyptian law allowed divorce, initiated by either party, though the consequences were more severe for the man, who had to return the wife's property and often pay additional compensation. A woman who divorced kept her belongings and her freedom, and she could remarry without stigma. The presence or absence of children profoundly affected any marriage. Fertility was desperately desired, for children meant security, continuity, someone to care for you in old age and maintain your memory after death. A woman who could not conceive faced social pressure and personal anguish. Prayers were offered to gods associated with fertility. Amulets were worn. Medical treatments were attempted, some based on genuine observation, others on pure hope. The desperation of childlessness echoes through magical texts and medical papyri, revealing how deeply this affliction was felt. When pregnancy came, it was greeted with joy tempered by realistic fear. Childbirth was dangerous, one of the times when death came closest to every woman, regardless of wealth or status. The process was attended by midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies, who knew the prayers and spells that might ease labor, who understood which complications could be managed and which were beyond human help. Women gave birth in a special pavilion or a designated area of the home, often squatting or kneeling on special birth bricks, using gravity to assist the process that men were excluded from witnessing. The goddess Tauret watched over childbirth, her form combining hippopotamus, lion, and crocodile fierce protectors all. She was depicted standing upright, pregnant belly prominent, sometimes holding the hieroglyph for protection. Amulets of Tauret were worn by pregnant women, placed near the birthing area, kept close as labor progressed. Bes, the dwarf god with his leonine mane and protruding tongue, also guarded mothers and infants, his ugliness meant to frighten away malevolent spirits that might harm the vulnerable. When the child emerged safely and the mother survived those crucial first hours, there was genuine celebration. A baby was washed, examined, wrapped in soft linen. If healthy, the infant was welcomed into the family with joy that needed no ceremony to make it real. The mother rested, recovering her strength, nursed the baby who depended entirely on her for survival. For the first months, mother and child were almost a single unit. The baby carried everywhere, fed on demand, never far from the warmth and security of the maternal body. Childhood in ancient Egypt was a time of relative freedom, at least in the early years. Small children played naked in the heat, their heads often shaved except for a distinctive side lock that identified them as young. They played games that would be recognizable to day tag and hide and seek, games with balls and sticks, dolls, and toy animals. Archaeological discoveries have revealed wooden toys with moving parts, leather balls stuffed with reeds, dolls with articulated limbs and real hair. These were not mere curiosities, but cherished possessions, evidence that Egyptian parents understood the importance of play in childhood. Yet childhood was also preparation. From the earliest age, children absorbed the rhythms and expectations of adult life through observation and gradual participation. A small girl watched her mother grind grain, and when she was strong enough, she was given her own small grinding stone to practice with. A boy followed his father to the fields or the workshop, initially just watching, then helping with simple tasks, eventually learning the full scope of his father's work. Education was not separated from life but woven into its daily fabric. For the children of scribes and the wealthy, formal education was possible. Schools attached to temples accepted boys, almost never girls, who would spend years learning to read and write, to calculate and keep records. The education was rigorous and often harsh. Students copied texts until their hands cramped, memorized mathematical problems and their solutions, learned the proper forms for official documents. Teachers did not hesitate to use physical punishment for laziness or errors. "A boy's ear is on his back," one text proclaimed. "He hears when he is beaten." Most children, however, received no formal education. They learned what they needed through apprenticeship to their parents or to a master craftsman. A girl learned to manage a household, to cook and weave and brew beer, to recognize medicinal plants and prepare remedies for common ailments. A boy learned his father's trade, whether that was farming or fishing, pottery or carpentry, acquiring skills through patient repetition until his hands knew the work without conscious thought. The relationship between parents and children was affectionate in ways that might surprise those who imagine ancient peoples as emotionally distant. Tomb paintings show parents playing with children, holding them tenderly, enjoying their presence. Inscriptions speak of beloved sons and daughters, of the grief when children died young, as they so often did. Infant mortality was high, childhood diseases were common, and even children who survived infancy faced dangers from accidents, infections, waterborne illnesses. Every parent knew the possibility of loss, and perhaps this made the living children even more precious. Siblings formed bonds that lasted through life. Brothers and sisters played together as children, worked together as they grew older, supported each other in adulthood. In a society where extended family was the primary social safety net, these relationships mattered enormously. A successful brother might help a sibling in need. Sisters might share childcare, pool resources, provide comfort during difficult times. The nuclear family was important, but it existed within a web of kinship that extended outward to include multiple generations and various degrees of relationship. Grandparents, when they survived to old age, were respected and valued. They possessed knowledge accumulated over decades, which plants healed which ailments, what signs predicted the river's behavior, the stories and songs that preserved cultural memory. Elderly women advised younger ones on childbirth and child rearing. Elderly men taught grandsons the finer points of crafts they had practiced for a lifetime. Old age brought physical decline, but it also brought status, the understanding that you had survived long enough to become wise, to be worth listening to. The home itself, whether humble or grand, was the container for all these relationships, the physical space where family life unfolded. The simplest homes were single-room structures with a courtyard, cooking done outdoors, sleeping done on mats that were rolled up during the day. More substantial homes had multiple rooms, a main living area, sleeping chambers, storage rooms, perhaps a small shrine where household gods received offerings. The wealthiest homes were elaborate complexes with multiple courtyards, gardens with pools, numerous rooms for family members and servants, walls painted with pleasant scenes. The courtyard was the heart of most Egyptian homes, a space open to the sky where much of daily life occurred. Here, women ground grain in the early morning coolness, the rhythmic sound of stone on stone, a familiar music. Here, children played under the watchful eyes of mothers and grandmothers. Here the family gathered in the evening when the day's heat finally relented, sitting in the fading light, talking quietly, telling stories that had been told for generations. The courtyard was neither fully inside nor outside, a liminal space that belonged entirely to the family, protected from the public world by walls, but open to the breezes and the stars. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed for most Egyptians. Families lived in close quarters with little separation between activities or people. Children witnessed the full range of adult life, birth and death, quarrels and reconciliation, the physical expressions of love between their parents. This intimacy created bonds but also tensions. Living so closely meant that conflicts could not be easily avoided, that every disagreement had audience and consequence. Yet it also meant that no one faced difficulties alone. That support was always present, that the joys of one became the joys of all. The daily routines of household life had a comforting predictability. Morning brought the lighting of the cooking fire, the preparation of bread dough, the fetching of water if the night's supply had been exhausted. Children were fed, faces washed, hair combed. The household shrine received its daily attention, a small offering of bread or beer, a brief prayer to the protective deities. Then the day's main work began, different for each family member, but all contributing to the household's survival and prosperity. Midday was often a time of rest, the heat too intense for much activity. People retreated to the coolest parts of the house, perhaps dozing, perhaps doing quiet work that didn't require much physical effort. Children might play in the shade, their games becoming slower, quieter in the oppressive heat. This was when the rooftop terraces proved their worth, catching any breeze that stirred, offering relief that ground-level rooms could not provide. Afternoon saw the resumption of work, though at a gentler pace. Women continued their endless textile work, spinning thread, weaving cloth, mending garments that had worn thin. These were social activities, often done in groups, providing opportunity for conversation, for the sharing of news and gossip that bound the community together. Men returned to their workshops or fields, knowing the worst of the heat had passed, that they could work productively until darkness fell. Evening was the time for family. The meal was prepared and shared, everyone gathering together, the simple act of eating becoming an affirmation of kinship and belonging. The food might be plain bread and onions, perhaps some fish, beer to drink, but it was consumed in the company of those who mattered most. After eating, there might be time for leisure. Children begged for stories, and the older members of the family obliged, recounting tales of gods and heroes, of clever animals and foolish people, stories that entertained and instructed simultaneously. Music was part of life even in humble homes. Someone might have a simple flute or drum, and in the evening coolness, melodies would emerge, accompanying songs that everyone knew. Singing was communal, participatory, not a performance for passive listeners, but an activity that included everyone. The songs covered every aspect of life-work songs that helped synchronize labor, love songs that expressed longing and joy, religious hymns that honored the gods, humorous songs that mocked pretension and celebrated the absurd. Physical affection within families was displayed openly and valued deeply. Parents embraced children, husbands and wives showed tenderness toward each other, siblings demonstrated their bonds through touch. Tomb paintings depict these gestures, a hand resting on a shoulder, couples sitting close together, children held in parental arms. These images were not merely artistic convention, but reflections of genuine emotion, of relationships that mattered intensely to those who lived them. Yet family life also contained its share of sorrow and difficulty. Not all marriages were happy. Some husbands were harsh or neglectful, some wives were difficult or unfaithful. Step-families formed when a parent died and the survivor remarried, creating complicated dynamics that required patience and adjustment. Economic pressures could strain relationships, particularly during years when the harvest failed or illness struck and medical treatments consumed resources. The idealized images in tombs showed family harmony, but the reality was more complex, more human. Death was an ever-present possibility, not an abstraction but a frequent visitor. Children died of fevers and infections, accidents and diseases that modern medicine could easily cure. Women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. Men died from work accidents, from wounds that became infected, from illnesses that struck suddenly. When death came, the grief was real and profound. The family mourned according to customs that prescribed specific behaviors, wailing and tearing of garments, throwing dust on heads, dramatic displays of sorrow that were not considered excessive but appropriate responses to genuine loss. The dead, however, did not entirely depart. They remained present in memory and in the belief that they continued to exist in another realm, that they could be contacted through offerings and prayers, that they still cared about the living family they had left behind. Tombs were visited, offerings left, conversations held with those who had passed beyond. This connection between living and dead meant that family extended across the boundary of mortality, that ancestors remained part of the household in a very real sense. For those who could afford it, the tomb became a kind of eternal home, decorated with scenes of the life the deceased had enjoyed, stocked with provisions for the afterlife, inscribed with prayers and spells meant to ensure safe passage and comfortable existence in the realm of the dead. But even the poor, who could not afford elaborate tombs, buried their dead with care and whatever goods could be spared, believing that love and proper ritual could help their departed family members in whatever lay beyond. As night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, as children finally succumbed to sleep and adults followed shortly after, the home became a place of rest and renewal. Tomorrow would bring the same routines, the same challenges and comforts, the same mix of frustration and satisfaction that characterized all human life. But tonight, gathered under one roof, protected by mud brick walls and household gods, the family existed in a bubble of intimacy and connection. These were the moments that made survival worthwhile, that gave meaning to the endless labor, that made the hard world softer and the brief span of life more bearable. Love, in all its forms, made the ancient Egyptians who they were not so different from us after all. Chapter 5. Shadows and Starlight. Beliefs that shaped everything. The ancient Egyptians lived in a world that breathed with divinity. The gods were not distant abstractions dwelling in some unreachable heaven, but immediate presences woven into the fabric of daily existence. The sun that rose each morning was Ra himself, sailing across the sky in his solar bark, battling the forces of chaos in the underworld each night to ensure dawn would come again. The Nile's annual flood was the tears of Isis mourning her murdered husband Osiris, or the life-giving fluids of the god Hapi, depending on which story you heard. The wind that cooled the evening air carried the breath of Shu, god of atmosphere. Divinity was everywhere, in everything, always. This was not monotheism, but neither was it simple polytheism. The Egyptian understanding of the divine was fluid, complex, sometimes contradictory. Gods could merge with each other, becoming composite deities like Amun-Ra, combining the hidden power of Amun with the solar majesty of Ra. The same god could appear in multiple forms. Hathor might be shown as a cow, as a woman with cow's ears, as a woman wearing a headdress of cow horns and a sun disk. These were not different gods, but different aspects, different ways of expressing divine attributes that exceeded human comprehension. Every locality had its own particular deities, gods who had been worshipped in that place since time immemorial. Sobek, the crocodile god, was especially venerated in the Fayum, where crocodiles were numerous and dangerous. Kenam, the ram-headed creator god, was supreme at Elephantine near the first cataract. Ptah was the patron of Memphis, the ancient capital. These local gods didn't prevent Egyptians from also honoring the great cosmic deities Ra and Osiris, Isis and Horus, but they added layers of devotion, creating a religious landscape as varied as the land itself. The temples were the gods' houses, magnificent structures built from stone meant to last eternally. But the average Egyptian rarely entered these temples. The innermost sanctuaries were forbidden to all but the highest priests, spaces so sacred that even pharaohs approached them with ritual caution. What happened inside was largely hidden from common view daily rituals of washing, clothing, and feeding the god statue. Ceremonies that maintained cosmic order, that kept the universe functioning as it should. Yet ordinary people were not excluded from religious life. At the outer courts of temples, they could bring offerings, make petitions, seek oracles. Festival days brought the gods out into the streets, their statues carried in procession on sacred barks, hidden within shrines but present among the people. These festivals were times of joy and celebration, when the boundaries between divine and human worlds grew thin, when beer flowed freely and restrictions loosened, when the normally rigid hierarchies of society relaxed into communal festivity. Personal piety found expression in small household shrines, simple niches in walls where images or amulets of protective deities received daily attention. A worker leaving for his labor might pause to murmur a prayer to Ptah, asking for skill and safety. A woman preparing to give birth kept amulets of Taret and Bez nearby, invoking their protection. A scribe beginning an important document might mentally acknowledge Thoth, god of writing and wisdom, seeking accuracy and clarity. These small acts of devotion were woven into daily life as naturally as breathing. The gods responded to prayers, or so people believed. Votive offerings left at shrines testified to answered petitions, a pair of ears carved in stone, dedicated to a god who had heard a plea, a stela describing how illness had been cured or danger averted through divine intervention. The relationship between humans and gods was transactional but also personal. You gave offerings and devotion, the gods gave protection and favor. But there was also genuine affection, real gratitude, a sense that the gods cared about human welfare, even if their ways were sometimes mysterious. Yet the divine world contained danger as well as protection. Some deities were fundamentally benevolent, but others were unpredictable, capable of causing harm. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, could bring plague and destruction when angered. Seth embodied chaos and violence, necessary for cosmic balance but dangerous when uncontrolled. Even beneficial gods could turn destructive if proper respect was not maintained. The world was full of demons and malevolent spirits, beings that lurked at the edges of order, seeking opportunities to cause mischief or worse. Magic was the defense against these dangers, and magic in Egypt was not separate from religion, but intimately connected to it. Spells invoked the gods, called upon their power to achieve specific ends. A magician, and many people knew at least basic magic, might recite words spoken by Isis when she healed her son Horus, applying that divine precedent to a current ailment. The words themselves had power, especially when written in hieroglyphs, which were not merely symbols but living things, capable of action and effect. Amulets were everywhere, worn by nearly everyone, from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself. These small objects carved from stone or molded from faience, shaped like gods or sacred animals or hieroglyphic symbols, provided protection against specific dangers. The Eye of Horus protected against injury and illness. The scarab beetle represented rebirth and transformation. The jed pillar gave stability and endurance. The Tayet knot, associated with Isis, protected women especially. People wore multiple amulets, creating personal collections of divine protection, insurance against a dangerous world. The concept of Mat was perhaps the most fundamental religious principle, though it transcended what we would call religion and entered the realm of cosmic philosophy. Mat was truth, justice, order, balance, everything that kept chaos at bay, that allowed the universe to function as it should. She was also a goddess, depicted as a woman wearing an ostrich feather on her head, that same feather which would later be used to weigh the hearts of the dead. But Mat was more than a deity. She was the principle by which everything operated, the fundamental law of existence itself. To live according to Mat meant acting justly, speaking truthfully, maintaining proper relationships with gods and humans alike. It meant doing your work well, treating others fairly, fulfilling your obligations to family and society. It meant avoiding Isfit chaos, disorder, injustice, everything that threatened to unravel the delicate fabric of cosmic order. The pharaoh's primary duty was to uphold Mat, to ensure through proper ritual and just rule that Egypt remained aligned with divine order. But every Egyptian, regardless of status, had the same responsibility on their own level. This belief gave moral structure to Egyptian society. Actions mattered not just for practical consequences, but for cosmic ones. To cheat a neighbor, to speak falsely, to neglect your duties. These were not merely social transgressions, but assaults on Mat itself, threats to the order that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding and the stars wheeling overhead. Conversely, living righteously contributed to universal stability. Your individual behavior, however humble your station, helped maintain the cosmos. The wisdom literature that has survived from ancient Egypt is filled with advice on how to live according to Mat. Do not speak falsely, one text advises. The god abhors it. Another counsels, if you are a man of trust, sent to reconcile disputants, do not distort the matter. Silence is more profitable than angry words. These were not abstract ethical principles, but practical guidance for Shiva, navigating daily life while maintaining cosmic harmony. The wise person understood that personal success and universal order were ultimately the same thing. Yet Egyptians were also pragmatic about human nature. They recognized that people fell short, that perfection was difficult, that even good people sometimes failed to uphold Mat. The gods themselves were not always perfect myths told of their quarrels and mistakes, their passions and revenges. What mattered was overall pattern, general intention, the effort to align oneself with order rather than chaos. A person who tried to live rightly, who recognized their failings and sought to do better, could hope for divine favor and a good outcome in the judgment that awaited after death. That judgment was the ultimate accountability, the moment when cosmic justice would be rendered. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending but a transition, a dangerous passage to another form of existence. The body had to be preserved through mummification. The deceased had to be equipped with proper provisions and magical texts. Elaborate rituals had to be performed to ensure safe passage through the perils of the underworld. But even with all this preparation, there remained the Hall of Two Truths, where final judgment occurred. In that hall, the deceased stood before Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, surrounded by 42 divine assessors. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Mat. The god Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of the necropolis, oversaw the weighing. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded the result. If the heart was lighter than the feather, unburdened by serious transgressions, the deceased was justified, declared true of voice, and permitted to enter the field of reeds, a paradise where life continued in idealized form. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, if it outweighed the feather, the consequence was final and terrible. The devourer waited beside the scale's Ammit, a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She consumed the hearts of the unjustified, and that was the end. Not punishment that eventually ended, but complete annihilation, cessation of existence, a fate more terrible than any torment, because it meant utter extinction, no second chance, no redemption. The fear of this judgment was real and influenced behavior in life. Tomb inscriptions proclaimed the deceased's righteousness, listing the things they had not done. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. I have not killed. I have not commanded killing. I have not made anyone suffer. I have not tampered with the temple offerings. I have not stolen the cakes of the dead. These negative confessions were part of the judgment ritual, but they also reflected genuine moral concerns, behaviors that Egyptians recognized as serious transgressions against Mat. Yet the Egyptian afterlife was not earned solely through moral behavior. It also required resources. Mummification was expensive, requiring specialists, materials, time. A proper tomb with decorated walls and necessary equipment cost even more. The very texts needed to guide the deceased through the afterlife, whether carved on tomb walls or written on papyrus scrolls, required literacy and resources to obtain. This created an uncomfortable reality. The afterlife seemed more accessible to the wealthy, who could afford the elaborate preparations, than to the poor, who might receive only simple burial. Yet the Egyptians were not blind to this inequality, and evidence suggests that over time, the democratization of the afterlife occurred. Beliefs and practices once reserved for pharaohs gradually became accessible to broader segments of society. The pyramid texts, originally carved only in royal tombs, evolved into the coffin texts available to wealthy non-royals, which eventually became the Book of the Dead spells that could be purchased by anyone who could afford a papyrus scroll. Even the poorest Egyptians buried their dead with what care they could manage, placing bodies in the hot sand where natural desiccation preserved them, adding whatever humble grave goods the family could spare, believing that love and intention mattered as much as elaborate ritual. The hope of resurrection was embodied in Osiris, whose myth was central to Egyptian understanding of death and rebirth. Osiris had been a good king, teaching civilization to humanity, ruling justly according to Maat. But his brother Seth, jealous and chaotic, murdered him, dismembering the body and scattering the pieces across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's devoted wife, searched until she found every piece, reassembled her husband's body, and through her magical power restored him to life, not in the mortal world, but as king of the realm of the dead. Every person who died hoped to follow Osiris's pattern, death followed by preservation, judgment, and ultimately resurrection into eternal life. This belief transformed how Egyptians understood their own mortality. Death was not the enemy but a doorway, something to be prepared for carefully, to be approached with proper knowledge and equipment, but ultimately something that could be transcended. The tomb became a house for eternity, furnished as carefully as any earthly dwelling, stocked with food and drink, decorated with images of the life the deceased had enjoyed and hoped to continue. The living visited these tombs, brought fresh offerings, spoke the names of the dead, keeping their memory alive and thereby sustaining their existence in the afterlife. The calendar was marked by religious festivals that celebrated the gods and reinforced cosmic order. The beautiful Feast of the Valley brought the statue of Amun from Karnak Temple across the river to visit the mortuary temples on the West Bank, the realm of the dead. Families gathered at ancestral tombs, shared meals with their deceased relatives, celebrated the continuity between living and dead. The Opet festival renewed the divine power of the pharaoh through ritual procession and ceremony. The festival of drunkenness honored Hathor through, as the name suggests, enthusiastic celebration involving considerable alcohol consumption, believed to recreate the time when Hathor's destructive rage was pacified by beer. These festivals broke the routine of daily labor, provided communal experiences that bound society together, and reaffirmed the relationship between human and divine worlds. They were times when boundaries blurred, when joy was not just permitted but encouraged, when the hardships of ordinary life could be temporarily forgotten in celebration. The gods, it seemed, wanted humans to be happy, to enjoy life as well as to work and maintain order. Religion was not all solemn duty, but also contained space for pleasure, for the sensory delights of music and dance, for the loosening effects of wine and beer, for laughter and physical joy. Dreams were taken seriously, understood as messages from the divine realm. Dream interpretation texts that have survived provide guidance on understanding these nocturnal visions. To dream of seeing your face in a mirror meant a new wife. To dream of drinking warm beer meant suffering would come. To dream of uncovering your own backside meant you would be orphaned. Modern readers might find these interpretations arbitrary, but for Egyptians, they represented genuine attempts to decode communications from gods and spirits who spoke in the symbolic language of sleep. Oracles provided another avenue for divine communication with ordinary people. At certain festivals, the sacred bark carrying a god statue would be carried by priests through crowds of petitioners. Questions would be called out, and the movements of the bark, tilting forward or back, moving smoothly or stopping suddenly, were interpreted as the god's response. This was direct, accessible divine guidance, and people trusted it for important decisions. Should I marry this person? Should I pursue this business venture? Has this person stolen from me? The god answered, and the answer was binding. Magic permeated every aspect of life, offering practical solutions to practical problems. Spells existed for everything, protecting houses from snakes, ensuring successful childbirth, making a reluctant lover notice you, healing headaches, preventing nightmares, guaranteeing a good harvest. These spells were not distinct from religion but continuous with it, both drawing on the same divine power, both operating through similar mechanisms of ritual action and sacred words. A person might pray to a god and simultaneously use a spell, seeing no contradiction in combining devotion with practical magic. The boundary between living and dead, between human and divine, between order and chaos, all these boundaries were real but permeable in Egyptian thought. The world was more fluid than our modern categories suggest, full of connections and correspondences, where actions in one realm affected others, where the material and spiritual were not separate but intertwined. This understanding gave tremendous significance to daily life. Everything mattered. Every action contributed to the cosmic balance. Every person, regardless of status, participated in maintaining the universe. As night deepened and the stars appeared, blazing in the clear desert sky unpolluted by artificial light, the Egyptians saw not random points of light, but divine beings pursuing their eternal courses. The circumpolar stars that never set were the blessed dead, transformed into imperishable spirits. The Milky Way was a river in the sky, parallel to the earthly Nile, another manifestation of the order that structured existence. The moon waxed and waned in its monthly cycle, the eye of Horus restored after being damaged, death and rebirth enacted overhead for all to witness. The night sky was a map of meaning, every constellation holding stories that had been told since before memory. The stars guided travelers across the desert, marked the seasons for farmers, provided the calendar by which festivals were celebrated and rituals performed. Astronomy and religion were inseparable, both concerned with understanding the patterns of the cosmos, with reading the divine language written in celestial movements. Priests who studied the stars were not scientists in our modern sense, but theologians, interpreting the will of the gods through careful observation of the heavens. This connection between earth and sky, between human action and cosmic consequence, gave Egyptians a sense of living in an enchanted universe. They did not experience reality as mechanical or random, but as purposeful, meaningful, responsive to human behavior. When you performed a ritual correctly, when you spoke the proper words, when you lived according to Maat, you were not merely following arbitrary rules, but participating in the fundamental structure of existence. You mattered. Your life had significance that extended beyond your individual survival to touch the eternal. Children absorbed these beliefs from their earliest days, not through formal instruction, but through the rhythms of daily life. They saw their parents make offerings at household shrines, heard prayers murmured before beginning important tasks, participated in festivals where the gods became tangibly present. They learned the names and attributes of deities as naturally as they learned the names of relatives. They grew up understanding that the world was alive with divine presence, that invisible forces surrounded them constantly, that protection and danger both dwelt close at hand. The amulets tied around their necks from infancy were more than decorations. They were shields against the unseen threats that prowled the boundaries of order, seeking opportunities to harm the vulnerable. Parents who placed these amulets on their children were not being superstitious in our dismissive sense, but were taking reasonable, precautions in a universe they understood to be genuinely dangerous. Just as you would keep a child from falling into the Nile, you would protect them from spiritual harm through appropriate magical means. Both dangers were equally real. As children matured and took on adult responsibilities, they inherited not just occupations and social roles, but also the religious duties that came with them. A farmer learned not just agricultural techniques, but the prayers and offerings that ensured divine favor for crops. A craftsman mastered not just technical skills, but the invocations to patron gods who blessed his work. A mother learned not just childcare, but the magic that protected infants, the prayers that eased labor, the rituals that honored the goddesses of childbirth. Religion was not separate from practical life, but the very foundation that made practical life possible. Old age, when achieved, brought a person closer to the boundary between worlds. The elderly were respected partly because they had accumulated wisdom, but also because they were approaching the threshold of transformation, would soon make the journey that every soul must eventually undertake. They had seen much, survived much, and their continued presence proved they had lived according to Mat sufficiently that the gods had granted them long years. Their advice on both practical and spiritual matters was sought and valued, for they stood between the realm of the living and the realm of the ancestors, belonging partially to both. When death finally came, the community responded with rituals that had been performed for thousands of years. The body was taken to the embalmers if the family could afford it, beginning the 70-day process of preservation. If not, the family did what they could with their own hands, wrapping the body in linen, placing it in whatever receptacle served as coffin. Mourners wailed and lamented, expressing genuine grief but also performing the necessary rituals that honored the deceased and assisted their transition. Professional mourners might be hired to ensure sufficient lamentation, for the dead needed the sorrow of the living, needed to know they would be remembered, that their name would continue to be spoken. The funeral procession carried the body to its final resting place, accompanied by priests and mourners, by bearers carrying goods for the tomb, by musicians whose instruments provided sacred soundtrack to the journey. At the tomb, the final rituals were performed, the opening of the mouth ceremony that restored to the deceased the ability to breathe, speak, eat, and drink in the afterlife. Offerings were presented, prayers recited, and then the tomb was sealed, though not permanently. The living would return, bringing fresh provisions, speaking the names of the dead, maintaining the connection that death had not severed. For those left behind, life continued but changed. A widow adjusted to managing alone what had been partnership. Children grew into roles their parents had held. The family reconstituted itself around the absence, finding new balance, new patterns. But the deceased was not truly gone. Their presence lingered in memory, in the objects they had used, in the habits they had established. They continued to exist in the afterlife, and if the living maintained proper offerings and remembrance, that existence could be pleasant, even joyful, a continuation of earthly life purified of suffering and hardship. This hope sustained the Egyptians through lives that were often difficult, often cut short by disease or accident, often marked by losses that modern medicine might have prevented. They believed that suffering was temporary, but existence was eternal, that the struggles of mortal life were merely prologue to an existence that would continue forever in the blessed field of reeds, where the barley grew 7 cubits high, where the harvest was always abundant, where the Nile flowed eternally, and work was light and pleasurable, where families reunited and remained together in paradise. As the night deepened toward its darkest hour, before the first hint of dawn appeared in the east, Egypt slept. In humble homes and grand villas, in cities and villages scattered along the Nile's length, people rested after the day's labors. Their dreams carried them into realms where God spoke, and the dead walked, and impossible things became briefly possible. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and deep beneath the earth, in the underworld of the Duat, Ra fought his nightly battle against the serpent of chaos, ensuring that morning would come again, that the sun would rise, that the world would continue for another day. The beliefs that shaped Egyptian civilization were not mere superstition or primitive misunderstanding. They were sophisticated attempts to make sense of existence, to find meaning in suffering, to establish connection between the visible and invisible, to create a framework where individual lives mattered in cosmic terms. These beliefs gave structure to society, comfort to the bereaved, hope to the dying, purpose to the living. They transformed the narrow valley of the Nile into a sacred landscape where every rock and tree, every creature and person, every moment and action participated in divine drama. And so the ancient Egyptians lived, generation after generation, for thousands of years, building, creating, loving, dying, always believing that their lives were part of something larger, something eternal, something that connected them to the gods and stars and to each other. When we look back across the vast distance of time, when we try to understand these people who lived so long ago, it is their beliefs that bring them closest. For in their hopes and fears, their prayers and rituals, their understanding that life was sacred and death was not the end, we recognize something fundamentally human, something that transcends culture and era, and speaks to the enduring questions that every person must face. What does it mean to live well? What happens when we die? How should we treat each other? What are we part of? The Egyptians had their answers written in stone and papyrus, enacted in ritual and daily practice, whispered in prayers and sung in hymns. And though their civilization has long since passed, though the temples stand empty and the tombs hold only silence, their answers still echo, still invite contemplation, still offer us the gift of seeing the world through eyes that found it filled with gods and meaning, with terror and beauty, with mortality and eternity intertwined. As dawn breaks over the desert once more, as it has broken every morning since the beginning of time, we can almost hear them still, those ancient voices, calling across the centuries, reminding us that we too are part of the eternal pattern, the endless cycle, the river that flows forever toward the sea. And so we've walked together through the world of ancient Egypt, not as tourists observing from distance, but as quiet witnesses to lives that were lived fully, loved deeply, and believed fiercely. These people who planted and harvested, who baked and brewed, who worked and worshipped, who raised children and buried parents, they were not so different from us. They laughed and wept, hoped and feared, found joy in simple pleasures and meaning in their daily labor. As sleep comes for you now, let the images linger softly, the Nile flowing eternal, the bread baking in morning ovens, the craftsman's hands shaping beauty from raw materials, the family gathered in evening coolness, the stars wheeling overhead in patterns that connected earth to heaven. Let these ancient rhythms carry you gently into rest, knowing that the human story is long and continuous, that we are part of something that began long before us and will continue long after, that the questions we face were faced by others who found their own answers and lived their lives with dignity and purpose. If these journeys through time bring you comfort in the quiet hours, if they accompany you softly toward sleep, then return whenever you need them. There are always more stories to tell, more worlds to explore, more voices from the past waiting to whisper their truths across the darkness. Until we meet again in another chapter of history, sleep well, rest deeply, and dream of rivers that flow forever, of stars that never fade, of lives that were lived long ago but still echo in the eternal present. Good night.